For as lauded as Christopher Nolan's filmmaking career has been over the last 2 decades, the filmmaker has been marred with one consistent problem. Something that has plagued the last 3 or 4 films he's released. Sound design. 2 words. If you do it right, you bring your audience closer to its subject. Do it wrong, and people start checking their TV sets or their theater and see if something is wrong. Christopher Nolan as of late has been the topic of much criticism for how he uses sound design. If you don't like the way he uses sound, I don't think there's anything one reviewer can say to change your mind. But I want to shed some details on why and how a Christopher Nolan film uses sound, as well as the reasons that sometimes they sound like a garbled mess. Obviously, I have to avoid using any actual audio from the films so I don't get this video pulled down, but I'm assuming most of you have seen a Christopher Nolan film before. I don't think I became aware of this problem until I sat down in a theater in 2012, when I was just watching his film, The Dark Knight Rises. I winced as I watched Tom Hardy choke through lines behind a mask. Never had I been more confused on the choices a filmmaker had made in terms of sound design. I can't really even defend Nolan here, per se, because I don't think it really works for this particular film. However, this seems to be the first film that Nolan truly experimented with sound design in terms of clarity, loudness, and the scope of sounds being heard at one time. Before this, I feel most Nolan films had a general clarity to how they were mixed, and they were mixed how most films are mixed. But Nolan started working in a different way when he started The Dark Knight Rises. Nolan had this to say in an interview with IndieWire a few years back. A couple films ago, we agreed we weren't going to mix films for substandard theaters. We're mixing for well-aligned, great theaters. Nolan would much rather work with the best standards in projection and make the mixes for those systems, rather than trying to make a mix that works for a broad range of theaters. I didn't really understand this line of thinking for a while. I remember considering it very pretentious and dismissive of the general public, until I stepped into a 70mm showing of Interstellar. The screen was massive, the mix was like a rocket ship, and the clarity muddled. But something clicked. I started to understand what Nolan was doing with his choices. See, Nolan is a filmmaker steeped in the traditions of film. He's a real filmmaker's filmmaker. He stems from the belief system of show, don't tell. You don't always need to tell the audience everything through dialogue, and that sometimes dialogue can be used in different ways. And according to the filmmaker himself, he had this to say: "There are particular moments in Interstellar where I decided to use dialogue as a sound effect. So sometimes it's mixed slightly underneath other sound effects or in other sound effects to emphasize how loud the surrounding noise is. This has a very visceral effect when combined with the loud sound systems of IMAX and 70mm showings. Even in regular theaters, the same effect can definitely be achieved. Clarity becomes null and void when a gunshot sounds like it's right over your shoulder. And I think that's why Christopher Nolan decided to make his film Dunkirk next. It's a film of very few words, and it's basically a masterclass in how to make sound design. This is truly where he hit his stride in terms of perfecting the more experimental audio mixes he was searching for. Christopher Nolan had this to say about his sound design choices: "I don't agree with the idea that you can only achieve clarity through dialogue. Clarity of story, clarity of emotions. I try to achieve that in a very layered way, using all different things at my disposal, picture and sound. I've always loved films that approach sound in an impressionistic way, and that is an unusual approach for a mainstream blockbuster. Sitting in a theater, I could feel the sting of every gunshot and the pulse of every ticking clock. The dialogue is basically unimportant in Dunkirk. Our heroes have a mission and they have to achieve it. We as the audience are smart enough to supplant our own ideas of how and why the characters are going to achieve their goals. And I think this is very basically a testing ground for Nolan's latest film and what I want to talk about today, Tenet. See, Tenet is the exact opposite of Dunkirk. It's a heady, complex film that has countless amounts of dialogue explaining every situation in great detail. I think this is where his mixing choices start to get more controversial. I think Nolan is intentionally obscuring the audio in the mix for a few reasons. First, I think Nolan wants you to go to the best quality theater you can possibly seek out. Second, I think Nolan wants the local theaters available to improve the projection quality of their theaters. And thirdly, I think Nolan is doing something very clever when he makes the mix a bit unclear. When I watched the film, I noticed it had taken a lot of influence from the director Nicholas Roeg. Scenes begin and end, and you are no more situated with your surroundings, other than what you can visually perceive. This allows Tenet to have a unique viewing experience, and I feel it's a very intentional part of the film. I think this is why the sound design is mixed in such a way that it prioritizes the visceral experience over the analytical one. You aren't supposed to think about Tenet, you're supposed to feel it. Every scene reinforces the next. If you stop and you ask questions, the film has probably already answered them. The film has an immense amount of inertia that carries us through scene by scene, and I think Tenet would be a much different film if the sound design had prioritized clarity over intensity. A film like Inception definitely requires every word to be heard by the audience, because every word could have some sort of double meaning. But in Tenet, the goal is so vague, basically stopping World War III, that we as the viewers don't need to know every small dialogue and motivation to the character. We just need to feel what the film wants us to feel in that moment. No better scene expresses this than the car chase scene. For anyone who hasn't watched, obviously, spoilers ahead. As we follow the protagonist onto the highway as he's chasing after the algorithm, as well as trying to save Kat, the mix is kicked up to a pulse-pounding level. Words between characters are basically chaotic screams. You can barely hear what they're actually trying to say, even though they're shouting at each other. But this creates an immense amount of tension as our heroes are coming dangerously close to crashing. When I sat down and watched this scene, it had been the first time I had watched a film in theaters since last year's Uncut Gems, a film that similarly had a unique sound design to it. In this moment, I could barely look at the screen because I was scared to jolt from my seat when the inevitable car crash was looming closer and closer. In that moment, I knew the sound design had me hooked. For every missed word, there was a sound effect that conveyed the emotion needed. For every piece of dialogue, dropped behind score, there was an adrenaline-pumping song keeping me invested in every small thing that happened. Tenet is not a film of great subtlety. It's a film that wants to pummel you with jaw-dropping visuals, spellbinding action, and heart attack-inducing soundtrack and sound design. Look, Tenet's sound design isn't perfect. The movie isn't perfect. But it was one of the best movie experiences I've had in a long time. I can totally understand why everyone wants to hear every line of dialogue. Feeling left out of something can definitely ruin one's experience of consuming a film. But I think the beauty of Tenet is that repeated viewings leave a lot for the audience to redigest. I know there are lines I missed for sure, but I sure as hell want to drop back into Tenet to find out what the hell John David Washington was saying in that opening scene. Until then, I'll stay mesmerized with how the film gripped me and made me feel I was 1 second away from that crash. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you can stay up to date with everything we have coming very soon. Thank you.